Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm going to make an autumn leaves tiled tray. I'm going to use this square coaster mould and some aquacast, which is a powder of 100 grams to water 35 gram ratio. I'm also going to use some air dry clay. This is Das clay. It's a grey clay that dries white. And I've taken some chunks and put it in this pot, and then I've mixed it with water to make a paste. So any scraps that I had, I put in, I added some water and just mixed it round. So I'm just going to weigh out and mix up some of my aquacast. I'm going to use 50 grams of the powder and 17 or thereabouts of the water. If I try and keep the measurements the same, then each tile should be the same thickness when it comes out. So I'll mix it thoroughly, and then I'm going to add 1 drop of this black pigment that is for eco pores, and I got that from Temu. By using 1 drop, hopefully again I can get a fairly consistent colour. So I'll mix it in completely. I want a solid colour, no marbling. Then I just need to pour it into the mould, tap it to remove any kind of bubbles, and fill the rest of the mould. And when I say fill, I'm not actually filling the tray. It's about 3/4 full. Because it is thinner than normal, I've let it dry for a couple of hours, and I made 3 more tiles the same way. I've sanded the edges of the back just to make them sit flat. And now I've got this stencil, and as you can see, it's not big enough to go all over. So I'm going to do a random pattern, and I'll just use parts of it on each individual tile. So I'm placing the stencil down, and then I'm going to take the clay that I made earlier. It's a paste, as you can see. I'm literally going to use this spatula to spread the paste over the surface. And I'm just trying to push down. I am spreading sideways, but I'm not scraping too hard. So I'll smooth it all over the surface. I've sped this up because it was boring to watch. I'll try not to scrape too thin, but I don't want to leave too thick of a layer, and I want to try and smooth the texture out. Once I'm happy, I can pull the stencil off, and I'll just clean up the edges. I can just scrape around to remove any bits hanging over. You can see you get this really nice raised effect, and I'm going to do the same on the other tiles. You can get a nice texture, but I don't want it too rough. So I'm going to try and smooth it out as much as I possibly can. Then I'll remove the stencil, clean up the edges, and I can scrape away any bits that might have filled in. Once all 4 tiles are done and are dry, you get this really nice raised effect. It's really clean looking as well. So I'm going to use the stencil yet again. And I have some ink pads, some distress oxides in the colour iced spruce and cracked pistachio, and I have a distress ink in spiced marmalade. I'm going to place my stencil back over the design, try and line it up, and I've got some blending brushes, and I'm going to use that to apply some colour to the leaves, just to the raised portion. So I'm literally blending in a circular motion. I have a different brush for each colour, and I'm just going to randomly place the colour on. I keep adding more ink and swirling around. Then I can change colour. I use some of the green now, the pistachio. And again, and then I will blend over the top of the colour that I have already put down. And I'll keep going and do this over all of the tiles. Then I can remove the stencil and the effect is complete. I'm going to carry on and do that with the rest of them, and the hardest part is literally trying to figure out how the tiles line up, how the stencil lines up on the tile. So I'm repeating the process of blending all the three colours. And when I pulled the stencil off this one, I found that I had slightly misaligned it, so I do have a slight white edge. So I was a little bit more careful lining up the next one, and I carried on doing the same blending technique on the other two tiles. And here's what all four tiles look like once they were done. Now I had to do some woodwork, and I used this square piece of wood, just junky wood that I had, and a jigsaw to cut it to the dimensions that I needed. And next I needed to make a frame, so I used a mitre box, and these are pieces of edging that go around laminate flooring that I had left over. I thought they would help make a nice frame. So I'm cutting some mitre angles, and I set it in place along my base just to mark where I would needed to make the next cut. So I needed to line the pieces up, mark where I needed to cut them, and I wanted to make sure the mark was in the center of that groove, and then I will cut along that angle. Strips have a kind of plastic coating, and I can take that off with some scissors later, and I'll fill any uneven edges. This is what the tray will look like eventually. Before I stick the edges down, I need to fill any uneven areas on the base piece of wood. It really was a nasty scrap piece of wood, but it's nothing that can't be filled and then painted over. After I've filled the holes and let it dry, I'm going to give it a good sand. Then I'll clean off any dust. And I just want to see if I can fix this wonky edge, which I managed to do. So now I am removing the plastic foil pieces from the cut edges of the strips, and I'll just sand them a little bit, trying to make it as smooth as possible. So this is the position I'm going to put them in, and I'm using No Nails glue, which is an instant grab glue. So I'm just putting that along the base of the strips. And it grabs pretty quickly, although it takes good 24 hours to completely set, but it is set within 45 minutes or so. I'm just putting the last bit on, and I forgot to show that I took the other ones off to make sure I put some glue on the end pieces, because I did forget to do that at the beginning. Now they're all in position, and I need to let that dry. I'm just putting the extra glue into the corners. That'll help to fill any gaps, and I'm going to leave that to set. And while that's setting, I sprayed my tiles with some clear lacquer. It's just an acrylic spray. I gave them a couple of coats. Okay, the glue is dry, but because these are edging strips, there's a gap here. So I'm going to use some decorator's cork, and I'm going to pipe some into these gaps and try and use my fingers to fill it, just to smooth it out. So I'm literally squeezing this gun and running a bead into the gap, And I might have to do this a couple of times just to fill up the hole. So I want to put the tiles in, and then I'm going to eventually coat my tiles with resin, and I don't want any areas where there might be some bubbles. It's really gloopy, this stuff. So I'm going to keep trying to fill them, make sure that there aren't any holes. As I say, I don't want any bubbles to come out when I put my resin on in the end. Then I just used a baby wipe to smooth around the edges, just getting rid of any excess, because I don't have a lot of room to put the tiles in. There's not a lot of space around them. I scooped up some of the extra and I used that to fill any gaps that might have been in the corners. Once this is painted, you'll not notice any of that. I cleaned the surfaces off with another baby wipe because that means less sanding later on. And then I left it to dry. And once it was, I took it outside and I gave it a coat of acrylic spray paint in a matte white. I concentrated on coating the outside edges and the top and on the inside edges, but I wasn't worried about covering the whole of the inside of the bottom, as that's going to be covered with tiles. Okay, the paint has thoroughly dried now and I'm ready to fix my tiles in. I have this water resistant fix and grout. It says it does, I think it's 10 tiles or something. So if I can open this packet, it's a little stiff. It's a creamy consistency. So I'm going to use this spatula and I'm going to spread the glue over the base. I want a nice thick layer. Then I can fix my tiles in place. They've been sprayed with the acrylic sealer. I'll just push them gently into the glue, leaving a small space. I'm not going to worry about using spacers as you would in proper tiling. This is literally just done by eye. I just squish them down so that they bed themselves into the glue. And then I'm going to have to leave these to completely dry before I can put the grout in. Yeah, this product says it is a grout too, so I will be using that to fill the spaces between the tiles and around the edge. Okay, I'm back and it says ready to grout in after 4 hours, which has been a bit longer than that. So I'm going to just use this little spatula and push the grout in between the tiles and also around the edges of the tiles too. Now, I haven't done a lot of grouting, but the last time I used it, it was a kind of sandy, almost like a polymer or a plastery type mixture. This was really creamy, really smooth, almost plasticky. And I quickly noticed that it was drying really quick when I was pushing it onto the surface of the tiles. So you're supposed to spread the grout and then use a damp cloth to wash it off. That's when I noticed my first problem. I use a sponge cloth and some warm water, and I started to rub the grout, which didn't really want to come off. I really had to start pushing hard to try and get it to come off. In fact, so hard that it started to shred the sponge. So I switched to a cloth, and as you can see, I'm really having to scrub quite hard. And because of that, despite the fact that the tiles were covered in a sealer, I noticed that it started to remove certainly some of the paint or the ink that I'd put on the tiles, but in some places actually the plaster, the DAS clay, the air dry clay that I'd put on there. But I carried on and persisted and managed to remove pretty much all of it. I certainly wouldn't use this grout again, but I had a few more areas just to fill in, so I used my fingers and I wiped the excess off straight away, which was a little bit better. So I just gave the surface a final wipe over, and then this needs to sit and dry. And once it's dry, I've mixed up some craft resin and I'm just going to coat the surface. I want a nice flat surface for my tray. This is a heat resistant and food safe kind of resin. So I just poured it across the surface, and then I used my stick just to move it into position and make sure that it covers all of the edges and there were no holes or fish eyes. Then I used my long neck lighter to burn any bubbles away. I got a little too close and singed my resin, so I just needed to pull that out. You can see it makes kind of little skin, so I just hooked that out, but it's a warning not to get your lighter too close, and then I had to leave that to just degas, and any bubbles that might come up there's got another little bit there. Any bubbles that come up, I will pop those as I go along. So I can see some bubbles stuck to the surface, and I'm just using a stick from a micro brush just to push them to the surface, and this time I used a craft heat gun just to pop them. Then I let it cure, but I checked back for bubbles. So I just want to show that I've put the resin on and it's still setting, but it's kind of leaking and it's almost seeping into the tiles and certainly into the clay, air dry clay on the surface. Now I did seal this with some acrylic varnish sealer, but I think perhaps when I was removing the grout, maybe I rubbed that surface off. I thought about sealing them again, but I thought it was probably going to be okay. I think that was a mistake. This isn't something I like, so I think I am going to try and rectify it. I've also got a small hole here. While this is still soft, I'm going to try and remove all of this resin and maybe get back to a bare tile. So I've successfully got it back to the tile, and I just used this metal palette knife literally to scrape the resin and the clay off the surface, so I can start again. Now my stencil's not going to work this time because I can't get right up into the corners. As you can see, it overlaps the frame, so I'm going to have to make my own stencil, and I did that literally by taking a photo of my frame as it is and basically redrawing the stencil as it is on the tiles. I cut it out of a stencil film using my Cricut, and now I am back to pushing my DAS clay paste through the stencil. I'm going to work on a quadrant at a time because it didn't quite line up, and it just seemed to be the easiest way to do this part. The stencil film is not quite as thick as the original stencil, so my relief won't be quite as deep, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it means that I'm going to be less prone to getting bubbles, but it still will allow me to put the colour on top. So I'm just going to go ahead and carry on doing that. And after I've lifted the stencil, I'm going to speed up the drying by using my craft heat gun before I can lay down the stencil in a new position and carry on doing my filling up. Okay, I've done all the clay now, and I've got my inks. This time I'm using wild honey instead of the iced spruce, but the process is exactly the same. I'm just going to use my blending brushes. I've got the stencil still in place, and I'm just going to push the colour through the stencil and onto the clay areas. So I finished my colouring in now, and I've taped it up to within an inch of its life. I don't want any of the spray acrylic varnish that I'm about to use to go onto the frame. I don't know that it would stop the resin from attaching, but I'm not taking that risk. So I'm going to take this outside and make sure that it gets a thorough coat of the varnish, and then this should prevent any bleeding later on. Okay, I did not film varnishing because you've seen me do that a couple of times. You can see that it's got a really lovely shine. So I'm just taking the tape off now. This has at least 3 coats on it, and I let it dry thoroughly in between each coat, and it's been drying for over 4 hours now. I'm going to mix up some more resin and give it a coat. You've already seen that, so I'm just going to skip ahead to the finished piece. Okay, and here it is. It's got a really nice smooth surface, apart from that one corner down by my thumb. And this is what the leaves look like close up. The colours are still vibrant. They haven't smudged and bled anywhere. There's one tile darker than the others, darker grey than the others. But that's okay. I used the same amount of colourant. It's just the way it turned out. I'm really happy with it. And this has been part of a collaboration for Mini Scenes GB and Crafty YouTubers United, and I hope you'll check out the rest of the people in the playlist. There'll be some fantastic artists who work hard to produce some free entertainment for you, so please give them and myself a like, a comment. It lets us know how we're doing, and it does help us on YouTube. And if you want to see what I'm doing next week, then please come back and consider subscribing. So thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again. Bye.